The flashing red and blue lights behind him weren't just confusing, they were infuriating. Officer Jake Monroe stared in disbelief through his rearview mirror, watching a golf cart with flashing orange lights weave erratically down the road in pursuit. The oversized security badge on the driver's shirt glistened in the afternoon sun, and the smug grin on the man's face sent Jake's blood boiling. This was not a police officer. It was Stanley, a pudgy, power-tripping HOA enforcer who now had the audacity to pull over a seasoned California Highway Patrol officer. Jake sighed, his hand instinctively hovering over his badge and gun. Years of intense training had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, but this? This was something else entirely. He pulled to the side of the road, curiosity winning out over annoyance. Stanley waddled up to Jake's window, clipboard in hand, adjusting his cheap sunglasses like he was about to issue a federal warrant. "Sir," Stanley barked, his voice shrill with self-importance. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Jake stared at him for a long moment, unsure if the man was serious. "Yeah," Jake said dryly. "I don't." Stanley's chest puffed out. "This is Pine Grove Estates. HOA policy strictly forbids commercial vehicles being parked or driven within community limits. And this," he gestured broadly at Jake's official CHP cruiser, "is a commercial vehicle." Jake let out a short laugh, the absurdity washing over him like cold water. "This is a patrol car," Jake said, still struggling to comprehend Stanley's confidence. "I'm a cop." "You're a homeowner," Stanley snapped, tapping his clipboard. "Which means you're under HOA jurisdiction the moment you cross those gates." Jake's amusement evaporated. "You're joking." "I never joke about HOA policy," Stanley said gravely. "If this vehicle isn't gone by tomorrow morning, we'll start fining you." He scribbled something on his clipboard, then slapped a citation onto Jake's windshield like he had just delivered a death sentence. Jake snatched the paper and glanced at it. $75 for violating HOA vehicle policy. He exhaled a sharp breath, telling himself it wasn't worth getting worked up over. Pine Grove Estates had been a quiet place when he moved in to care for his aging mother, but now he was starting to see the dark side of his seemingly peaceful community. The next morning, Jake awoke to find a second violation notice stuffed under his wiper. This one claimed his cruiser's tires were unsightly due to dirt splatter. His annoyance grew into full-blown rage when he spotted Stanley a few houses down, clipboard in hand, chatting smugly with Bert Dinkley, the HOA president. Bert was a wiry, balding man who walked like he had absolute control over everything within a 5-foot radius. Jake knew the type: power-hungry, manipulative, and always armed with some obscure rule to get their way. Jake decided enough was enough. Marching down the street in his uniform, badge on full display, he approached Stanley and Bert. "You're not putting another ticket on my car," Jake growled. Bert smirked. "I understand you're a CHP officer, Monroe, but Pine Grove Estates operates under a strict set of guidelines. If you can't follow them, there will be consequences." "You're threatening me now?" Jake shot back. "Not a threat," Bert said, his voice syrupy with fake charm. "Just a reminder. If you keep pushing, I'll start exploring ways to enforce the rules more aggressively." Jake clenched his fists. He was a patient man, but the smugness in Bert's eyes made him want to test just how well HOA fines could survive under the weight of a CHP-issued baton. For a while, Jake ignored the HOA's antics. But Stanley's tactics escalated. Violation notices started arriving daily: fines for leaving his trash bins out 2 minutes too long, for parking too close to the curb, and even for his garden hose being too visible. Then came the real blow. A certified letter informing Jake that multiple violations could result in the HOA filing a lien on his property. His home, the one he bought to care for his mother, was now at risk. Jake realized this wasn't just an overzealous HOA president on a power trip. It was a calculated move. He started noticing a pattern. Elderly residents were targeted most heavily, fines stacking up until they were forced to sell their homes cheaply. The homes, oddly enough, seemed to end up in the hands of private investors, all close friends of Bert. Determined to expose what was really happening, Jake dug deeper. He learned that Bert's so-called investors had formed a shell company, quietly flipping properties for profit. Worse still, HOA funds seemed to be mysteriously disappearing, and residents who protested found themselves buried in endless violations until they gave up. One night, after a late shift, Jake returned home to find his patrol car missing from his driveway. Furious, he called the local impound lot and learned his car had been towed by request of the HOA. Jake stormed into the HOA office the next morning, finding Bert sipping coffee behind his pristine desk. "You had my patrol car towed?" Jake snapped. "That's right," Bert said smugly. "Commercial vehicle." "You've crossed the line," Jake warned. "I know what you're doing. I know about the shell company. I know about the missing HOA funds. This won't end well for you." Bert's face darkened, and his smile turned cold. "Be careful, Monroe," he said, his voice low. "A man can find himself in a lot of trouble if he doesn't know when to back off." The warning rang in Jake's ears as he walked home. Something about the way Bert had said it left Jake unsettled. Bert wasn't just playing HOA politics anymore. This was something bigger. Something more dangerous. The next morning, Jake found a dead rat nailed to his front door. Attached to it was a note. "Don't push it." Jake knew then that this wasn't just about fines anymore. Bert's operation was deeper, dirtier, and far more dangerous than he had imagined. It wasn't just Jake's home at stake now. It was the entire neighborhood. Maybe even lives. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Jake Monroe knew he couldn't sit back and let the HOA continue its harassment. The dead rat on his door was no idle threat. It was a warning that things had moved far beyond petty fines and neighborhood politics. He spent the next morning carefully documenting everything, every violation notice, every threat, every suspicious interaction with Bert Dinkley. He even took photographs of the rat and the note before tossing them in the garbage. Years of working as a highway patrol officer had taught him the value of evidence. And this felt like the kind of case that was going to need it later. That afternoon, Jake parked his newly retrieved patrol car prominently in his driveway, positioning it at just the right angle to irritate Bert and Stanley. Predictably, Stanley showed up within 20 minutes, clipboard in hand. Jake stepped out of his house before Stanley could place yet another violation notice on his windshield. "Don't bother," Jake said, crossing his arms. "I'm not moving it." Stanley smiled smugly. "Then expect another fine." "You know what, Stanley?" Jake said, his voice calm. "Why don't you tell your boss that if he wants my car gone, he can talk to me himself?" Stanley's grin faltered slightly, but he scribbled on his clipboard anyway before waddling back down the street. Jake waited until Stanley was out of sight before heading to his neighbor Maggie's house. Maggie was in her 60s, a retired cybersecurity consultant with a sharp mind and no love for the HOA. Jake knew she'd been hit with her fair share of ridiculous fines as well. Maggie let Jake inside and handed him a cup of coffee before he could even ask. She listened quietly as Jake laid out everything: the bogus violations, the suspicious fines targeting elderly residents, the shell company buying up properties. When he finished, Maggie leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed. "You're right," she said. "Bert's got his hands in something big." Jake wasn't surprised. Maggie was the kind of person who saw patterns where others didn't. Over the years, she had quietly collected her own pile of evidence against Bert: financial records, property transfers, and even photographs of Bert meeting with shady-looking individuals who seemed to have no legitimate business in Pine Grove Estates. What she didn't have, however, was the kind of hard evidence that could take Bert down for good. "We need proof," Jake said. "Something undeniable." Over the next week, Jake and Maggie set up a series of hidden cameras along Jake's property and in a few strategic locations around the neighborhood. Maggie, with her technical skills, ensured they blended seamlessly into porch lights, bird feeders, and even decorative lawn ornaments. They caught hours of footage, mostly Stanley stomping around, writing bogus fines, but nothing that tied Bert directly to his corrupt scheme. That changed one night when Jake returned home late from a patrol shift. He pulled into his driveway and spotted two figures in dark clothing sneaking around a neighbor's house. The home belonged to an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carlson, who had been complaining for weeks about harassment from the HOA. Jake shut off his headlights and quietly approached on foot, staying low and using the shadows to his advantage. As he neared the property, he realized the two figures were Bert and Stanley. Stanley stood by the garage door while Bert peered into the windows, checking to see if anyone was home. Then Bert knelt by the lock and started tampering with it. Jake's breath caught. They were trying to break in. Before Jake could react, Bert slipped a manila envelope under the door and whispered something to Stanley before they both crept away. Jake waited until they were gone, then walked up to the house. He retrieved the envelope and took it home to inspect its contents. Inside were several forms, legal documents demanding immediate HOA payment, alongside a letter stating that non-compliance could result in foreclosure. Attached was a kind offer from a company Jake recognized as one of Bert's suspected shell corporations, offering to buy the Carlsons' home at a fraction of its value. It was a textbook intimidation tactic: scare the homeowners with threats of legal action, then sweep in with a lowball offer they'd feel pressured to take. The next morning, Jake visited the Carlsons to warn them. The elderly couple was terrified. Mrs. Carlson showed Jake a series of letters they'd received in the past month, each one more threatening than the last. The Carlsons had tried to pay their fines, but each payment was followed by a new accusation of some obscure violation. The HOA was bleeding them dry. That afternoon, Jake decided to confront Bert directly. He marched into the HOA office without knocking and slapped the manila envelope onto Bert's desk. Bert didn't flinch. "You're harassing the Carlsons," Jake growled. "And you're using your fake real estate company to cash in on people who can't fight back." Bert smiled lazily. "That's a strong accusation," he said. "But I don't think you've got much proof." "You and I both know what's going on," Jake shot back. "I've got enough to start an investigation. And when that happens, it's not just you that's going down. It's anyone connected to you." Bert leaned forward, his smug smile turning sharp. "Be careful, Monroe," he said coldly. "You poke around too much, and things might get unpleasant." Jake left the office with his blood boiling. He knew Bert wasn't bluffing. That night, while reviewing footage with Maggie, they caught something disturbing. Two men, both unfamiliar, standing outside Jake's home. They lingered for several minutes, staring at his patrol car and whispering before disappearing into the night. This wasn't just HOA politics anymore. Bert's operation was deeper, dirtier, and far more dangerous than Jake had realized. Determined to hit back hard, Jake devised a plan. The next evening, he waited inside his patrol car, parked just far enough down the street to keep watch without drawing attention. Sure enough, around midnight, the same two figures returned. This time, they moved to his backyard, attempting to tamper with the lock on his shed. Jake emerged quietly, his hand on his sidearm. "Don't move," Jake barked. The two men froze. He ordered them to the ground, cuffed them, and called for backup. The men weren't just hired thugs. They were contractors tied directly to one of Bert's companies. Under questioning, one of them spilled everything. Bert had been pressuring residents into leaving their homes, forging violations, and even sabotaging properties to make them look unsellable. If residents refused to sell, Bert used threats, intimidation, and harassment to force their hand. Jake knew this was the break he'd been waiting for. With Maggie's evidence and the confessions from Bert's hired goons, he had enough to bring the case to the local authorities. But Jake also knew Bert wasn't the kind of man to go down quietly. That night, Jake kept his patrol car parked in the driveway, its lights flashing brightly enough for the entire neighborhood to see. It wasn't just a warning to Bert. It was a promise. Jake wasn't backing down. Pine Grove Estates didn't belong to Bert Dinkley anymore. It was time for the neighborhood to fight back. The days following the arrest of Bert's hired thugs were tense. Jake Monroe knew that exposing Bert's corruption wouldn't be enough to stop him entirely. Bert was smart, and men like him had layers of protection. Even with evidence tying him to intimidation, forgery, and harassment, Bert hadn't been arrested yet. The authorities were still gathering a stronger case. And until then, Bert was free to walk the streets of Pine Grove Estates, as smug and untouchable as ever. Jake's patrol car had become a symbol of resistance in the neighborhood. People who once feared speaking out against the HOA began to approach him quietly during his morning jogs or grocery runs. They shared their own experiences, stories of intimidation, fines that seemed suspiciously targeted, and property offers that came only after residents had been bled dry by endless violations. Jake knew the case was growing, but he needed a final nail in the coffin. Something undeniable that would leave no loopholes for Bert to slither through. Maggie's research uncovered something even more disturbing. Bert's real estate scam wasn't just about flipping homes. The shell company tied to him had been funneling money into other suspicious accounts. Large sums were being transferred to unnamed offshore accounts. And there was evidence of potential ties to organized crime. Bert wasn't just scamming homeowners. He was part of something far more dangerous. Determined to get a closer look, Jake decided to bait Bert into making a mistake. Using a contact within the CHP, Jake recruited 2 off-duty officers to pose as potential property investors. With Maggie's help, they created a convincing backstory: wealthy developers interested in distressed properties like those Bert had been targeting. The goal was simple: catch Bert discussing his operation openly. The staged meeting took place in a local diner just outside the community. Bert arrived confidently, shaking hands with the fake investors and slipping into his role as the friendly businessman with ease. Jake watched from a nearby booth, pretending to read a newspaper. The conversation began innocently enough: discussions about property values, neighborhood improvements, and investment potential. But soon, Bert's arrogance began to show. "You'd be surprised what you can accomplish with a little persuasion," Bert said smugly, stirring his coffee. "A few fines here and there, and suddenly people are desperate to sell. The trick is timing: pressure them long enough, and they'll fold." One of the officers posing as an investor leaned in. "And the HOA doesn't push back on this?" Bert chuckled. "I run the HOA," he said. "I decide what's a violation. Trust me, there's always a way to make people pay. Once they're desperate enough, they'll sell for pennies." The arrogance in Bert's voice made Jake's fists clench under the table. Bert was so confident in his control over Pine Grove Estates that he didn't even bother to keep his methods a secret. After recording enough incriminating remarks to solidify Bert's role in the scam, Jake stepped outside to call his CHP captain and alert the local authorities. But before Jake could make the call, a sleek black SUV pulled into the diner's parking lot. Jake recognized one of the men inside, a heavy-set figure he'd seen in Maggie's surveillance footage. This wasn't one of Bert's cronies. This was someone higher up the chain. The man entered the diner, exchanged a brief nod with Bert, then slipped an envelope into his hand before leaving just as quickly. Jake knew that envelope wasn't filled with paperwork. It was money. Bert wasn't just feeding off HOA corruption, he was laundering money for organized criminals. That envelope was payback for whatever role Bert had played in their larger scheme. The situation had grown far more dangerous than Jake expected. Bert's arrogance had led him to make a mistake. But Jake knew cornering a man like that was dangerous. If Bert realized he was being targeted by law enforcement, he might lash out. Jake decided they had to act fast. That night, Jake and Maggie reviewed all the evidence. Footage from the fake investor meeting, surveillance of Bert's late-night exchanges, and financial records showing suspicious transfers connected to organized crime. Jake presented the case to his CHP captain the next morning, who in turn reached out to the district attorney. A raid was approved, but they needed Jake's help to make it happen. The plan was to catch Bert red-handed during one of his payoff meetings. Surveillance indicated another meeting was scheduled for the following Friday night, this time at the HOA office itself. The location was risky. Bert knew the HOA office inside and out, and if things went sideways, there were too many blind spots for comfort. Jake insisted on being involved directly, arguing that no one knew Pine Grove Estates better than he did. The night of the operation, Jake positioned himself just down the road from the HOA office. His CHP team remained hidden in unmarked vehicles nearby. Just after 10 p.m., Bert's black SUV rolled in. Jake recognized the driver, the same man from the diner. Moments later, Bert stepped outside, with Stanley trailing behind him like a loyal dog. Jake knew Stanley was mostly harmless, a coward hiding behind Bert's bravado. But tonight, there was no room for mistakes. The SUV driver handed Bert another envelope. Jake gave the signal. Officers surrounded the vehicle, guns drawn. Bert's face twisted from confusion to panic as he realized what was happening. Stanley bolted for the back door of the HOA office, but Jake intercepted him with ease. The look of pure terror on Stanley's face almost made Jake laugh. "You've got the wrong guy." Bert barked as officers cuffed him. "This is a mistake. You can't prove anything." "You'd be surprised what a little persuasion can do," Jake said coolly. "Sound familiar?" Inside Bert's SUV, officers found stacks of cash. Fake violation notices pre-written with Pine Grove Estates residents' addresses. And detailed ledgers tracking money transfers to various offshore accounts. The evidence was overwhelming. Bert wasn't just going to jail. He was going away for a long time. Over the following weeks, the residents of Pine Grove Estates began to reclaim their neighborhood. Without Bert pulling the strings, the HOA board members who had once feared him came forward with additional evidence, exposing even more layers of corruption. Fines were dismissed. Wrongful foreclosures were reversed. And Bert's tangled web of lies began to unravel. For the first time in months, Pine Grove Estates felt like a community again. Neighbors began to trust one another. Families who had once kept to themselves now gathered in the park or waved from their porches. The HOA board elected a new president, a kind-hearted, retired teacher named Miss Parker, who promised to restore fairness and reason to the neighborhood. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch drinking a cold beer, Maggie joined him. They watched kids playing in the street, their laughter echoing off the houses. "You really shook things up around here," Maggie said. Jake chuckled. "Didn't plan on becoming the neighborhood hero." "Well," Maggie said, "next time Stanley tries to fine you for your grass being half an inch too tall, I expect you to handle it with a little less drama." Jake laughed harder than he had in weeks. No promises. But the peace in Pine Grove Estates didn't last long. Just when the neighborhood seemed to be returning to normal, rumors started circulating that Bert Dinkley had made bail. Jake Monroe wasn't surprised. Bert had money, connections, and a knack for slipping out of tight corners. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Bert had secured his release pending trial. The residents of Pine Grove Estates were nervous. Even though Bert couldn't legally return to the community, people still whispered about what he might try to do next. Jake kept a watchful eye on his surroundings. He knew Bert was the type to lash out when cornered. And after years in law enforcement, Jake had learned that desperate men made dangerous decisions. Maggie agreed. She was convinced Bert still had people working for him, HOA loyalists or thugs from his criminal dealings. Jake believed her. And when he spotted Stanley lurking near his property one evening, his suspicions only grew stronger. Stanley looked different. He wasn't the smug, clipboard-wielding nuisance anymore. He seemed nervous, fidgety, and paranoid. Jake approached him on the sidewalk. "What are you doing here, Stanley?" Jake asked, his voice firm. Stanley flinched like he'd been caught in a crime. "I was just walking," he stammered. Jake narrowed his eyes. "You're not supposed to be near my property. Or anyone's, for that matter." Stanley swallowed hard, then blurted, "He's coming back." Jake stiffened. "Who's coming back?" "Bert," Stanley whispered. "He's not done yet. He says he's taking everything back." Jake could tell Stanley was terrified. Whatever Bert had told him had shaken him to the core. Stanley was no mastermind, just a follower. But Jake knew a warning when he heard one. He pressed Stanley for more details, but Stanley refused to say anything else and hurried away down the street. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, watching the neighborhood like a sentry. The air felt heavy, like a storm was building. Around midnight, Jake noticed something. A van. Slowly circling the block. It passed his house twice, each time pausing near his driveway. Jake grabbed his badge and firearm, slipping quietly into the shadows. When the van circled back a third time, Jake moved swiftly, stepping into the street and holding up his badge. Out of the vehicle, Jake called out. The van's engine revved, and the driver bolted down the road. Jake sprinted to his patrol car and gave chase. The van sped through Pine Grove's winding streets, barely missing parked cars and skidding around corners. Jake kept his siren off, hoping to stay unnoticed until the van reached the neighborhood's exit. As expected, the van turned toward the main gate. But when it reached the exit, another car blocked the path. Maggie's car. She had been listening to Jake's police radio and acted fast. With nowhere to go, the van's driver jumped out and ran toward the wooded area behind the community. Jake was faster. He caught up, tackled the man, and pinned him to the ground. The man wasn't some hired thug. It was one of Bert's former HOA board members, a guy named Greg Turner, who had mysteriously avoided trouble during Bert's initial arrest. Jake hauled Greg to his patrol car and called for backup. While waiting, Jake searched Greg's van and found something chilling. A stack of papers with residents' names, addresses, and coded markings. Some homes had red marks beside them. Jake's house was one of them. So was Maggie's.